Fillet of fish from a dish, share box and evening frocks, Big Mac down a cul-de-sac and even under a drying rack, medium fries in rainy skies, or maybe cheeseburgers in the bath. How daft. Wraps through cat flaps, nugs on rugs, or perhaps a McChicken sandwich to the river. Because yes, we deliver. Download Uber Eats or Just Eat and enjoy McDonald's at home. At participating McDonald's and locations only. See mcdonalds.co.uk/McDelivery to see if there's one near you. See Uber Eats or Just Eat app for full details. Delivery fee applies.
Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Remember, data is the commodity. You're just the product. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
As President-elect Joe Biden is about to be sworn in, I thought it'd be a good idea to have a look at the legacy of Donald Trump over the last 4 years. And so I'm joined by author David Neiwert, who wrote the fantastic book Red Pill, Blue Pill, How to Counteract the Conspiracy Theories That Are Killing Us. And he also wrote the book Alt America, The Rise of the Radical Right in the Age of Trump. It seemed appropriate to have a chat with David today about the terrible events of the 6th of January in which violent Trump supporters stormed the US Capitol building. And we take a look at what those events could mean for the future as President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in as President of the United States. Will these events be the beginning of the end of the far right, or will it mean continued violence in the long run? And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting it by becoming a Patreon subscriber. You'll get early access to episodes and transcripts. Also, if you're a fan of spy films, please do check out my spy film, The Dry Cleaner, which is available on Amazon and iTunes. Just type in The Dry Cleaner film and you should find it. If you don't put the word film in, you might find something else. I've included a link to the trailer in the show notes below. We also have some podcast merchandise, so you can now walk around with Secrets and Spies, cups, coasters, t-shirts and tote bags, which is really handy if you're trying to save plastic on your weekly shop. If you find what David has to say very interesting today, don't forget to check out his books, and I'll leave the links in the show notes below. Without further ado, let's begin.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
David, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
For the benefit of new listeners, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience?
Sure. Well, I'm an old newsman. I came up in newspapers in the Pacific Northwest, mostly in Idaho and Montana. And in the first few years of my work, I was directly involved in having to cover far-right extremists because we had an outfit called the Aryan Nations that moved into northern Idaho in the late 1970s when I happened to be the very young editor of a newspaper there in the Panhandle. And so I've had a lot of exposure to right-wing extremists and covering them. Really since the late 70s. And in the 90s, I began reporting on, as a freelance writer, I began reporting on the growth of this movement we called the militia movement or patriot movement. And then it kind of exploded in Oklahoma City in 1995. And suddenly I found myself an expert in right-wing extremists because I'd been one of the only reporters who'd gone out and talked to these guys. Now, keep in mind, I had been mainly an environmental reporter up to that point, or at least that was what the field I was working in at the time I was reporting on them because I was doing it as an anti-environmental backlash story. And but after Oklahoma City, I decided I was convinced to really make it a full-time beat, a dedicated beat that I could focus on and build the kind of institutional knowledge that I think that you need to have when properly covering this kind of stuff. So I've been doing that really for, since 95. So 25 years as a dedicated beat. And I wrote for the Southern Poverty Law Center from 2013 to 19, and then went to work for Daily Kos in 2019, and I'm working there. It's been actually a nice shift because SPLC was kind of limiting for me because I still want to write about the environment. So Daily Kos lets me write a few environmental stories, but they mostly hired me for my expertise in right-wing extremism.
So the events of the 6th of January, as I was just saying to you before we started, when I watched things unfold, I thought the first person I want to speak to is you. So what are your thoughts on the 6th of January attack on the Capitol? Is what you saw surprising, or was it something that you think's been building for a while?
Well, Chris, you would know, of course, that I've been arguing all along that this has been building for 30 years.
Yeah. I in fact wrote previews about this event, and the morning of the 6th, I published a story saying that among the things that they were talking about and that was likely to happen today was an invasion of the Capitol. Yeah.
So, there was. I did previews for this event and was warning people for a long time that something bad was going to happen pretty soon. And so it's not a surprise at all. And honestly, my view of those events was that this was really the apotheosis of a couple of trends that we've been seeing for a while. One of them is, of course, the significant expansion of the numbers of people who are drawn into right-wing extremist belief systems. And this has been going on. And this is, of course, there are multiple factions there, but the larger universe, which, I called Alt America in my book, Alt America, is this alternative universe of conspiracy theories and alternative facts that they have created for themselves. And there's a lot of different zones in that universe. There's the QAnon zone and the Proud Boys zone and the all the various white nationalist belief systems that all sort of intercommingle, but they also sort of occupy different parts of that universe. And we really saw them come together under Trump. I mean, one of the things we definitely saw in the last 2 months of the election campaign was this coalescence of right-wing extremists with ostensibly mainstream Republicans. Particularly, I'm thinking of these Trump train events that we had throughout the country, where people would get in their pickups and their with their Trump flags and their Gadsden flags and American flags, and form these long caravans and drive through mostly urban liberal cities, demonstrating their love of Trump. And at these events, and particularly, they gather in big parking lots beforehand and have a bunch of speeches with each other. We were seeing, really massive participation in these events by Proud Boys and militia types, 3%ers, and those kinds of folks, and QAnon folks. Right there alongside all these, regular sort of lifelong Republican dedicated Trump fans. And so really we were just seeing the spread of this extremism right into the embrace of an official campaign. And it started culminating in things like, remember the incident where the Trump train tried to drive a Biden-Harris campaign bus up?
Yes, I do remember that, yeah.
Off the road in Texas. And that was, I think, really our first indication that, these folks weren't playing around and that they were going to be really engaging in acts of intimidation and terrorism and, very threatening behavior and ultimately acts of insurrection, right? And I got to tell you, I mean, having been somebody who was covering the militia movement in the 90s and then the Tea Party movement during the Obama years, this kind of rhetoric, this sort of seditionist rhetoric of talking about overthrowing the government and hanging government officials and assassinating politicians and engaging in a civil war against their liberal neighbors has been floating around a really long time. But it really has gained a kind of terminal velocity at this point, and that's what we were seeing on January 6th, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's not great to put it this way, but it kind of seemed like the logical conclusion of that kind of rhetoric, really.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, eventually they're going to, I mean, if they obviously believe eventually they're going to, some of them are going to act on it. And especially when they're being encouraged to do so by the President of the United States.
Well, what can you tell us about, because a picture is sort of forming now, a clearer picture. What can you tell us about the sort of various groups who've been found to be involved in the attack? It sort of appears to be a real potpourri of different groups.
Well, probably the one that's most salient right now is the Oath Keepers, which is one of these far-right patriot militia groups that specializes primarily in recruiting and organizing veterans, military veterans, and law enforcement officers. And I mean, the name refers to, keeping your oath to the Constitution, right? That you take when you're a law enforcement officer in the United States, and when you're a military in the United States. And this is part of the sort of mythology that these extremists have built up around themselves. They do call themselves patriots and constitutionalists, but of course those names are actually travesties of what they claim to represent. Because as far as the patriots go, honestly, having been hung out with them a great deal, I can tell you, you've never heard a more seditionist lot in your life. I mean, this is why I say that this rhetoric of sedition has been around for a very long time and has been tolerated sort of under the guise of, First Amendment protection of free speech. But there are in fact laws against all these things. It's actually illegal it's breaking the federal law to threaten to kill any federal official, and particularly including the president or vice president or speaker of the House. It's against the law to openly talk about overthrowing the current form of government and replacing it with another, especially if you are doing it in tandem with paramilitary activities. Preparing basically is essentially assembling a force to be able to use force. And that's when sedition laws really get their teeth. And that's why they're actually now charging some of these folks with sedition. Yeah. And then, it's always been illegal to share bomb making plans on the internet. And they've been doing this kind of stuff for years. And it's finally, now we're starting to realize, it's not just hot talk. It's not just people going off. These people actually mean what they're saying.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because a lot of people do dismiss it as people just blowing off steam, and because it's on the internet, it's somehow not real,
Yeah, that it's just, he's just being ironic, or, he's just mad. Don't take it seriously. Of course, he's not going to actually invade the Capitol.
Oh, my goodness.
So I mean, there's been a lot of this going around, and for a long time, and now we're finally realizing that we need to take it seriously, which is good. I mean, I've been saying we need to take it seriously for 30 years, but
better late than never.
I'm glad they're catching up.
Oh my goodness! I mean, and there's been some reports coming out of people who actually wanted to kidnap and execute both senators, lawmakers, and Vice President Mike Pence. And I've seen video footage of people with walkie-talkies looking, all dressed up, and they've got zip ties or something, and somebody erected a
gallows. They were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" as they entered the Capitol. Yeah. And they were clearly, you can see from the videos that they were really trying hard to seek out very specific lawmakers, particularly Pelosi and Pence.
Yeah, and one person, I've forgotten her name. She's sort of on the internet. They call her kind of like the QAnon senator who was tweeting out where Nancy Pelosi's location was all the time.
Lauren Boebert, the freshly elected QAnon congressman from Colorado. Yeah, I think she's actually going to be facing some real legal issues because she apparently was also the person who was giving reconnaissance tours the day before. And helping some of these extremists sort of figure out their way around the inside of the Capitol.
Wow. And have they actually linked people from that earlier tour to the events the following day yet, or are they still?
Yeah. So I think there's a good likelihood that there are going to be members of Congress getting frog marched off to prison, and frankly, there should be. Yeah. I mean, from what we saw. There's very clearly that this was coordinated and organized, and we need to find out who was involved in that.
Yeah, definitely. And it seemed, again, like there's been quite a range of people who've been involved in that, because you've had some police officers and military people have been found to have been involved. You kind of get I don't know what to call them really,
and this is where the Oath Keepers come in, by the way. Because they have recruited a lot of people who are actually active members of police departments and military. And so I would not be surprised. We do know that it was a group of Oath Keepers that made their way through the crowd and were played a key role in breaking down that police barrier. And these were guys, if you see the video, you can see that they were all trained and engaging in trained behavior, using hand signals and coordinated. These are clearly people with military training. And so that's, and so the FBI is focusing a lot of its investigation right now on the Oath Keepers. Now, as it happened in the months leading up to all this, the Oath Keepers were kicked off of Twitter for advocating for a civil war, and this after the right-wing Patriot Prayer guy was shot by the anti-fascists in Portland. Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, went on this long rant and just saying, "It's on now. It's a civil war." And he actually there was a December 15th pro-Trump event called the Million MAGA March.
Oh, yes, yeah.
At which Rhodes was one of the speakers, and he was urging Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act.
Yeah, I saw a bit of that on Twitter.
And declare martial law.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, if you know the history of the Oath Keepers, they originated in 2008 and 2009 when they were claiming that Democrats were going to be trying to, basically the right-wing fear was that the Democrats were going to be taking away everybody's guns and rounding up people and putting them in concentration camps. And that was what the Oath Keepers were all about. They were initially, all about, we're trying to stave off martial law. They were claiming that Obama was going to invoke martial law.
Oh, yeah, these so-called FEMA camps, yeah.
Yeah. And so by the end of course, now that the loop came around, now they're pro martial law, and this is what I mean about how everything's a travesty on the far right of what they claim to be, what they say they are, but they really essential to sort of the right-wing extremist mindset is this self-conception of being heroes, of being heroic mythology, and they build up this heroic mythology around themselves. So they call themselves patriots and constitutionalists and oh, we're defending the Constitution, we're going to save America. And, I mean, and of course, this is, you find this all across the board in all these various factions. The QAnon believers, which is another faction that was out there. This is that authoritarian conspiracy cult that believes, that the Democratic leaders in Hollywood are secretly a bunch of globalist pedophilia.
Yeah, they seem to be really obsessed with paedophilia and sex crimes, strangely, don't they? It seems to be a bit of a feature of the far right and QAnon and people.
Right. And so they are, they're out to save the children. They're going to save America from this evil gang of pedophiles that is kidnapping children away and storing them in tunnel and sucking out their blood so they can harvest the adrenochrome and drink the adrenochrome so they can live longer.
And that links in with because there's that famous anti-Semitic blood libel, isn't there? That kind of links into that theory.
Yes. Oh, there's all kinds of undertones, not just blood libel, but of course the whole protocols of the Seven Elders of Zion with the globalism theories. So there's those folks, and then of course there's also the Proud Boys, who are basically Trump's brown shirt army. I mean, that's functionally the role they play. They are street thugs who go out to beat up leftists, and their whole raison d'etre is to create a narrative about the violent left. And, they're really good at saying, oh, yeah, we just happened to go have a peaceful demonstration, a peaceful rally in these urban liberal centers, and we got attacked by these leftists, right? But I've hung out with these guys, and they're all there so that they can get in fights, so they can go brawl, and I want to punch some Antifa.
Yeah, a bit like the football hooligan problem we had in the 90s here. I don't know, I mean, it was predates that too, but it seemed to reach a massive peak in the late 80s, early 90s. And football was kind of not the real reason. It was just the excuse that these groups used to go out and beat each other up at weekends. There's a very good film with Gary Oldman called The Firm that kind of looks at that. But similar kind of thing, isn't it?
Yes, except it's political.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Proud Boys keep, and obviously the far right and the QAnon keep going on about this this horrible, mysterious leftist group known as Antifa, who apparently are so Machiavellian that they somehow managed to engineer this entire thing. Can you talk to us about Antifa, the myth of Antifa?
Well, interestingly, I mean, if you think about it, Chris, I don't think anybody in America or Europe had heard the word Antifa prior to about late 2017.
Yeah.
Very few people had even heard the term. And suddenly, within about a year's time, they were this global existential threat to America. Right?
They're very quick, aren't they? Not many startups that are successful in their first year.
Yeah. I did a piece for Daily Kos discussing, how the actual origins of that whole narrative. And it all started in conspiracy theories. Around the time of Trump's inauguration in 2017, this theory cropped up, particularly among the Alex Jones quadrant and elsewhere, claiming that far leftists and communists under the Antifa banner were organizing to try to prevent Trump from actually taking the oath of office, and were plotting to attack the inauguration or do some kind of thing where they would basically take over America. And it was like sort of a Red Dawn conspiracy theory, that these communists were secretly going to overthrow America in one swell swoop by stopping Donald Trump from taking office. Now, this theory didn't really spread into the mainstream much, but it was very active in the conspiracist world. And it got revived later that November of the same year, with this claim that again there was a plot in November to have a coup to displace Trump and replace him, and that it was being led by Antifa. Right. Well, that actually gained more traction and was spread throughout mainstream right-wing media, particularly Fox News, and discussed by at these supposedly mainstream channels. In large part, I think, because that took place after Charlottesville, and Charlottesville was really the event where most Americans became aware of the existence of Antifa. Because they were out there in the streets. And interestingly, one of the things that came out of Charlottesville was that we saw, instead of any kind of condemnation of white nationalists or white supremacists or, the kind of violence that they brought, we saw in places like Fox News just a sort of sustained attack on Antifa as being the problem in Charlottesville, rather than white supremacists and neo-Nazis, which, of course, fit in nicely with Trump's, there were some very fine people on both sides.
Yes.
But over the next, so I did this thing where I tracked, what stories started appearing when about Antifa. And it was really after that November conspiracy that never, of course, occurred, that we started really seeing right-wing media pick up this storyline that Antifa, it was this horrific existential threat to the United States. And it again all had these origins in completely cockamamie conspiracy theories. But once Fox News picked up that ball and ran with it, then it's really spread widely. And of course, Donald Trump picked it up and began denouncing Antifa, and then the rest was history. So the reality is, now I covered, I think, 18 of these events involving conflicts between Proud Boys and a group called Patriot Prayer that's based here in the Northwest, that would organize these far-right street demonstrations in liberal urban centers, particularly Portland, Oregon, Berkeley, California, and Seattle. And like I said, in Seattle area, they held a couple of events down in the state capitol in Olympia as well. At all of these events, it was pretty remarkable to see that very few, in fact, it was really hard to find anyone from Portland on the Proud Boys side in these events. They were all guys who lived in rural parts of the state and rural Washington as well, or at least ex-urban areas. A few of them lived in suburbs, but none of them actually lived in Portland. They were coming to Portland because they wanted to beat up people from Portland, and they were coming armored. They were coming with helmets, coming with sticks. Some of them actually came with guns, but Portland has pretty strict laws about open carry, so they couldn't actually do the open carry in Portland. But a couple of their other events where open carry is permitted, I did see plenty of guns, and of course they probably all had them in their cars anyway. So yeah, and but uniformly, not only that, my experience with and I will admit, I mostly hung out on the right-wing side, so I could hear what they were saying and what they were talking about. But I did spend some time with the anti-fascist side and listen to them. And I got to tell you, my main impression of them was that the vast majority of them were, people like me, that they're just ordinary citizens of the liberal bent who want to stand up to this stuff.
Yeah.
And understand that it's toxic. There is a minority faction within the anti-fascists of black bloc folks do sometimes engage in irresponsible behavior. But at the same time, they also, their main focus is to try to prevent these proto-fascists from inflicting violence on their communities. And so most of the times that I saw anti-fascists engaged in violence, it was primarily defensive. But at the same time, we also saw that the police, the law enforcement that was out to sort of handle these events, was very clearly, heavily biased towards the Proud Boys side and against the anti-fascists. They engaged in very aggressive tactics against the anti-fascists and a fair amount of brutality.
Can we touch on law enforcement for a minute? Because
sure,
we briefly mentioned it before, but there's been a lot of discussion about far-right infiltration of law enforcement and the military. How real a threat is that, and how deep do you think it is, and I suppose, is there a way out of that?
Yeah, well, there is a way out, and that is a dedicated focus. But yes, it is a very real problem. It's fairly pervasive. Particularly, I think cops are already have a very conservative culture, and this has been something that's grown somewhat separate from all this activity, because I think police in general have become increasingly conservative, right-wing leaning over the last 20 years.
Is there anything in particular that kind of in that time period you think caused that?
Fox News, and one of the things that does cause it is the fact that, like in such cities as Seattle and Portland, cost of living there has gone up tremendously. And so as a result, very few of the police officers who are on the beat in those cities can actually afford to live there.
Yeah.
Most of them live in these suburbs and exurbs.
So they're not part of the community they're policing. So
That's right. And we've certainly seen a tremendous growth of very contemptuous attitudes towards the very people that they're supposed to be serving and protecting among these police officers, particularly as we've seen expressed through their unions. Unions in particular are just noxiously right-wing and very hateful towards liberals. And my question has always been, well, how can you have a police force that has nothing but contempt for the police people they're supposed to be protecting? It doesn't work.
Yeah. If we're supposed to believe crime fictions, at Harry Bosch, he has a phrase about everybody matters or nobody does, or something like that. Everybody should matter, shouldn't they?
Yes.
The law enforcement picture in the States is different to the UK, and I've always been mainly, again, through just things I've watched, that you have like sheriffs, you have state police, you have city police. I think you even have highway patrols, and then obviously you've got the federal authorities like the FBI and so on.
Highway patrol is almost always state police, by the way.
Is it? Yeah. Are there any particular sections of that kind of massive law enforcement picture that tend to be more prone to this, or is it just a kind of over-wide thing?
Sheriff's departments in particular have been really vulnerable to this kind of recruitment. There's an outfit called the Constitutionalist Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, run by a guy named Richard Mack. They're straight up constitutionalists. Mack was closely associated with the Clive and Bundy folks.
Yeah.
And they basically preach that sheriffs, the county sheriff, is actually the highest law of the land, and that the sheriff is able to overrule and refuse to enforce and ignore federal laws and federal law enforcement. That any FBI agent who comes into a county is actually now under the command of that county sheriff, right? And that's what they argue. Well, there's a ton of sheriffs out there that buy into this stuff. We did a piece when I was working for the SPLC called "Line in the Sand" that we tried to survey the nation's sheriffs to see how many of them were participating in this stuff.
Yeah.
And we couldn't get a firm number, mainly because so many sheriffs refused to participate. But I think that the indications were that it's a pretty substantial number of cops that are involved in this, or sheriffs and their deputies who are engaged in this stuff. And, this bleeds right over into the same problem we have with city police officers joining the Oath Keepers and, and military veterans joining the Oath Keepers. So, and we've actually seen some police officers joining the Proud Boys, so, but yeah, there was a reason that there was a large number of police officers who were among the people arrested for invading the Capitol, because they were all there at the behest of people like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys.
Yeah. And is there any, has there been any sort of evidence or suggestion, I'm trying to think of the right word there, that like federal organizations like the FBI, Homeland Security, and those kind of people have problems with that? I think I get the impression Homeland Security seems to be vulnerable to that mindset, but
FBI has actually done a great job the past year of really cracking down, particularly on neo-Nazis and we had the base arrests and Adamhoff SS arrests. They arrested that gang of militiamen in Michigan as well. So, no, actually, the FBI, I got to just tip my hat to them. I think they've been doing a pretty good job of being recognizing finally this threat. I mean, they've been ignoring it for the previous 20, but hey,
they got there in the end.
It took you a long time to get here, but glad you're here now, sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think actually I tip my hat to Chris Wray, the director of the FBI. He withstood tremendous pressure from Trump to try to claim that, Trump wanted to claim that the summer riots and the violence around him was all caused by Antifa, and that the Antifa was the biggest terrorist threat America faced. And Chris Wray went before Congress and said, no, Antifa is not really an organization, it's a movement, and we can't designate them a terrorist group. And really far and away our greatest threat is white supremacists and white nationalists. Yeah. And Trump wanted to fire him for it, but he said this in September or something like that, August and September, and in the middle of the campaign, and he knew it would really fuck the campaign up if he tried to fire the FBI director that summer. So he just kind of wrote it out. But as you may, there was a lot of talk that, Trump really wanted to fire Chris Wray before the end of the year, in large part because he had made him look bad on the whole Antifa question. So I'll give my hat to the FBI. Now, the DHS has tried to reform itself internally. The problem is it's had these Trump appointees running the show at the top. And frankly, these guys were too incompetent to cause too many problems. But I don't think DHS was in a position or was able to be very aggressive about it. And hopefully they will be in the coming years, because I can tell you this, we're going to have at least 4 years of ongoing insurgency from the radical right. I mean, that was the main message we got from January 6th, actually, that we're going to have at least 4 years of this.
We'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to ask you one last question about law enforcement military. What's the situation with the far right in the military?
Well, we've had, this is an ongoing thing. I'm actually working on a story I can't talk about too much right now, involving
it's fine.
Someone who's in a very sensitive position in a really important military base, who's been spending the last 3 years advocating for the Boogaloo, and talking about the Boogaloo and telling people how to, which is the Boogaloo is the right-wing plan for a civil war that destroys the old order and brings about whatever they have in mind. So I would say, and it's the problem with the military. There's two problems with the military. Obviously, if somebody is in the military and is able to sabotage operations or to share confidential information with our enemies, that sort of thing, I think that that's that the really security risks, I think that that's always a problem, because that's something that is potentially there. And that's why, for instance, they are going through the members of the National Guard who are going to be at the inauguration.
Well, this is on my mind because as we speak right now,
Yeah.
you've got the National Guard in Washington, D.C. at the moment. And, it's sort of, if you start to think about far-right infiltration, is somebody going to go wild with their firearm?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, like we saw with Sadat, right? Sadat's assassination. Yeah, I don't know. I assume, and I believe they have thought of this, because I know that, actually, Tucker Carlson is all outraged right now because the National Guardsmen are being vetted for whether or not they're right-wing extremists. And he did a segment on it last night, saying that they're trying to destroy our institutions and so on and so forth. And the Secretary of State of Texas, Greg Abbott, called it a huge insult to the members of the National Guard that they're being suspected of potential, betrayal. But the reality is that this is just basic operational security that you have to do if you're going to have that many members of the military out there. And we have had a significant problem with, there's a lot of folks in the military that are involved in this stuff. I mean, the only murder we had this summer of a law enforcement officer during those riots was one in Oakland who was shot and killed by a right-wing boogaloo guy. Who actually happened to be a serving, an active member of the Air Force, and he shot and killed a sheriff's deputy 5 days later when they came to try to arrest him for the act in Oakland. And that guy's named Steve Carrillo. He's standing waiting trial right now.
Yeah, and the lady who was shot by police in the Capitol was former Air Force, and the guy with the zip ties, I think, was former Air Force as well.
Yeah, huge numbers of people with military backgrounds and engaged in this stuff. Yes. So that's when we get into the McVeigh factor, right? I mean, we're really lucky. We've been lucky through most of American history, in that so many of our right-wing extremists weren't, particularly the ones who were inclined to acts of terrorism, haven't been terribly competent, because very few of them actually have any kind of real training or understanding of the handling of materiel or firearms. They're basically kind of self-taught amateurs for the most part.
Yeah.
Danger factor comes in when you get somebody who is radicalized this way, who actually does have that training. And the classic example of that is Timothy McVeigh, who had gotten all kinds of good material training during the Iraq War that basically enabled him to pull off the Oklahoma City bombing. Same with Eric Rudolph, the Atlanta Olympics pipe bomb or backpack. He was also a military veteran.
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that we have consistently seen is that some of the very worst acts have been committed by people with actual experience and who are skilled at handling this kind of stuff. That means that the competence factor of these terrorists goes up significantly, and therefore that they represent goes up as well.
One last question on this theme of law enforcement. Sorry for the focus. I just find it fascinating. Has there been any case of anybody in the Secret Service with far-right leanings?
For the most part, the Secret Service is a really buttoned-down agency, and really we don't know a whole lot about them. And typically their agents don't engage in politics afterwards, but some of them do. And in fact, Dan Bongino, the big pro-Trump guy who, he's part of Trump's inner circle, and we see him on social media all the time, is in fact a former Secret Service agent who worked for George W. Bush.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, some of these guys. So some of them do get into politics, but yeah, that's a much murkier area. So yeah, my understanding is that they went through and created a whole new team for Biden within the Secret Service that had nothing to do with any of Trump's detail.
Yeah, I could imagine after all the coronavirus stuff and various other things the Secret Service have endured over 4 years, I would have thought that one agency would be very glad to see the end of the Trump administration. But
I think they privately probably are.
Yeah.
But I can't also help but imagine that some of those agents actually were supportive and sympathetic.
No, definitely. Have the events of 6th of January empowered or weakened the far right and their supporters, do you think?
Well, I think it was both. I think it was a huge propaganda coup, and it told them that because it told them that, hey, we can make these fantasies come true.
Yeah.
That we can actually pull these things off, and we can. This is something that we don't just have to be talking about it. We can actually make it happen. And I think that sense spread throughout the movement, however, and it actually kind of a sense of accomplishment within the first couple of days. But what we've seen since is that very much like Charlottesville, we've had this huge outbreak of internal bickering, well, really internecine warfare within the radical right, with all of them pointing fingers and accusing each others and taking credit and taking blame for various aspects of the insurrection. And so we were supposed to have, Sunday, we were supposed to have the Million Militia March in downtown DC. There were supposed to be 1 million militiamen showing up. Not a single one. Not one showed up. It was it was beyond a complete bust. It was epic. And likewise, we were supposed to be seeing these demonstrations in various state capitals. The most we saw was just smatterings, handfuls of these guys showing up at the state capitals. So I would say that it like Charlottesville, it also had a really disorienting and effect on the movement. It's basically scattered them. And also, obviously, I think that the wave of arrests that have followed after January 6th have tamped down a lot of that enthusiasm a lot.
Well, I wondered,
So we're going to go through a period of internecine quarreling. It's mostly, I think, is going to mean that we aren't going to see, armed bands of men engaging in acts of terrorism the way that they're planning to. We were seeing a fair amount of that in 2019 and 2020, which is what the arrests by the FBI of the base and Adamhoff represented, and the Michigan guys. I don't think that's. Mainly because there's been so much internecine quarreling going on. But I do think that we are going to see, really probably within a matter of a few weeks, a real spike in lone wolf terrorism. Especially once the reality sinks in that, oh, God, this guy really is president. I mean, they've been telling themselves that Biden will never be president. He will never be inaugurated. It's not going to happen, and Trump you'll see, Trump will write in and save the day at the last minute. And this is what they've been telling themselves for a long time. And then after tomorrow happens or after, the inauguration happens,
which we hope happens, but
I'm pretty confident it will. I mean, I can tell you DC is locked down right now. But they, I think that after the inauguration and it sinks in, and once Biden starts, rolling back the Trump legacy and repealing all this stuff that Trump did, and they start seeing, his presidency become a reality, as well as the destruction of Trumpism that it's going to represent. I think we're going to start seeing a real spike in lone wolf domestic terrorism, and eventually we will get back around to seeing armed bands as well.
Mm-hmm. I just fear for another Oklahoma style event. That definitely worries me.
Well, yeah, I mean, it only takes one or two of these guys to cause. This is something that everybody, you kind of say, oh well, they're only a fringe. There's only a tiny handful. I don't think that that's true. I think they're larger than we think, but even so, even if it's just a tiny number of them, it only takes one or two to wreak a whole lot of havoc and hurt a lot of people and kill a lot of people and disrupt society in ways that we can't really even reckon with. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you think people will now take the kind of the far right more seriously?
Yeah, I do think that. I've been gaining a pretty steady flow of new followers on Twitter since January 6th. I mean, I would say I get close to probably 1,000 a day.
Yeah.
So,
wow, that's well done.
Now
well done.
Are going, I need to figure this out, and so they're starting to turn to experts, the people who actually know how to address the problem. Instead of listening to the people who've been telling us all these years, oh, it's not really a problem. I mean, you still have people like Glenn Greenwald running around and saying, oh, the problem isn't those fascist insurrectionists. The problem is the liberals who are trying to shut down President Trump.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I don't, Glenn Greenwald's a mystery to me, but he really is. He's yeah.
Oh, there's that whole faction out there of people who are supposedly on the left who constantly are poo-pooing and downplaying this issue and just saying, oh, they just they're just they're just hapless pawns. They're just people reacting out of economic angst, and the real problem is neoliberal economic policy that's impoverishing.
Yeah. It's been a very popular thing for many years, since 2015 in the UK, and certainly since Trump. And it was I can't remember the name because I'm really not a names person, but Bernie Sanders' former communications person has a podcast, and they had an episode with Noam Chomsky, and basically he was basically arguing for why everybody should vote for Biden, because he felt it is one of the most sensible choices is to vote for Biden and get rid of Trump. And they were arguing with him, saying, well, no, we've got to defeat capitalism first before we can do anything. So really we need Trump because he will expose the flaws in capitalism. And I just don't understand this sort of burn the house down approach that seems to have become very popular on certain factions of the left, certainly, and on the right too, in their own way.
Well, I understand it. They are frustrated by the fact that establishment Democrats, middle of the road Democrats, very much dug in. And yes, those Democrats and moderate liberals, they don't play nicely with the left. Always. Sometimes they do. I really think that Biden's administration is going to be far more progressive than people think. A lot of that's going to have to do with Kamala Harris, who is far more progressive than people give her credit for. And I think Biden is also very open to this because, frankly, the intransigence and radicalism of the Republican right in the last 4, 5, 6 years has really created an opening for progressives that we haven't had before, of saying, these right-wing people are just leading us down a path, and we need to take a different path. And I think that those progressive paths look pretty attractive to people like Biden. Because they are constructive alternatives instead of reactionary alternatives, which is what there was a lot of during the Obama years. As excellent a president as Obama was, he was very timid about pursuing really progressive policies, and particularly about dealing with race and right-wing extremism, Partly because I think that he was afraid of the consequences of taking them on, of a black president taking these things on, and maybe not unreasonably. He may have been. There may have been some wisdom to that, but the result was that we dithered and we basically around for 8 years dealing with the growth of this problem. We basically pretended it wasn't happening, and we're paying for it now. So I do think Biden's gonna. I actually think Biden may get that. We'll see. All we can do is cross our fingers and hope they figure it out.
Yeah, definitely. So as we record this is the eve of the inauguration. So tomorrow, should everything go according to plan, Trump should be leaving office at midday, and President-elect Joe Biden should be sworn in. So sort of two key questions, I suppose. Could you give us your thought on Trump's impact on America and the far right? And then the second question, which I can remind you of in a minute, is what are your hopes for a Biden administration, and what should his administration do to tackle the rise of the far right?
Very good questions, actually. My answer on Trump really is fairly simple and clear. I have said from the get-go that essentially Donald Trump took the lid off the national ed. When he was elected, and really even during the campaign, he created this path where it became okay to be openly bigoted and to be a fucking jackass in public, as we have seen on multiple videos distributed on social media since. But also, it was, as we also saw in the first month of his presidency, when we saw this incredible spike in hate crimes, unlike anything we've ever seen. Over 1,000 hate crimes in 1 month, which is just unbelievable numbers. And around half of these people, when you examine the incidences, as I did, I actually tallied up I went through the incidents one by one and tallied up the numbers of people who were either using Trump's name directly or engaging in his rhetoric while committing these hate crimes. And it was 47% of them, which is really significant. So, I mean, really, I have a very simple way of putting it. Trump basically took the lid off the Pandora's box of our national ed. All of the demons came flying out. And what we are hoping for now is that at least with Biden being elected, we can put the lid back on that box. But those demons are out there, and we're going to be spending the next 5 to 10 years dealing with them. And we need to be ready for that. So, into the second question, what can Biden do to deal with this? Well, there are a number of things. One of the things they should not do, which they are talking about, is create a sort of 9/11 commission to examine the thing, and they're talking about basically unleashing the CIA on Americans and things. We've seen a lot of discussions of various approaches to how to do it, and they're all federal law enforcement heavy, and it's all about enabling sort of a police state type approach, and it won't work. And B is just so wrongheaded, it would just take us in completely the opposite direction we need to go.
It kind of inadvertently feeds into those conspiracy theories, because as somebody put it quite well, the myth of the deep states now will become very real for some people.
I do think that there are things that the Biden administration can and should do, and these actually play directly into some of the issues that we had over the summer involving police brutality and police treatment of Black people. And this is we need to actually have law enforcement be actively engaged in the work of enforcing the laws we have on the books dealing with these people. We need to get our law enforcement culture to where it recognizes the threat and then actually enforces the laws we already have that will more than adequately get this problem under control. I mean, like I said, it's already illegal to be sharing bomb-making plans. Why those people aren't being instantly arrested for doing so is actually on our law enforcement. It's also actually against the law in all 50 states in the United States to form private armies, to form militias. These laws have been on the books since between around the 1890s and 1910 period is when a lot of those laws were passed, and they had to do with the use of armed thugs, basically private armies, hired by robber barons to go attack labor organizers, right? But those militias, those private armies that we are now being plagued with, are in fact illegal. In every state in the union, they're just allowed to persist because law enforcement turns a blind eye to them. We have to stop turning a blind eye to them, and we won't be able to turn a blind eye to them until we get rid of all of these right-wing extremists who have infiltrated our law enforcement capacity now. So we need to clean up our law enforcement. We need to change their approach to how they enforce the law, and then And I think that we will, in the process of doing so, we'll also see a significant increase in better relations between minority communities and leftist communities and those police departments, because they'll recognize, there will be just naturally a shift. And so, I think we need to clean up our police departments. There needs to be a program aimed at cleaning them out. There needs to be a program aimed at providing them with the kind of training that they need. Particularly hate crimes training is one of the real blank areas for most law enforcement agencies in the country, because they do a terrible job of enforcing hate crimes and dealing with hate crimes in their communities. And a lot of this has to do with those same crappy attitudes that they have about, that's just, a bunch of liberals trying to be politically correct type stuff.
Attitude's so frustrating.
As somebody who's written about hate crimes for a long time, I could tell you that law enforcement's deliberate ignorance is a really a major problem, and has been for a long time. And it's one of the reasons, the biggest problem we have with hate crimes in America is that they are underreported. And the law enforcement agencies play a huge role in that on multiple fronts. So, I think that a Biden administration shouldn't go about trying to pass a bunch of new laws and trying to create a federal designation for domestic terrorism. Although I think that would be okay. But the problem is that if they ever passed it and didn't put in the proper kind of safeguards for it, for doing that, then the next time we have a President Trump, that law is going to be insanely abused, because then he would have the room to actually designate Antifa a terrorist organization. So, which fortunately he really didn't have, and it's mainly because that legislation isn't there. So I don't know that we want to be handing future Trumps that particular hammer, I think really we should be dealing with what the laws are in the books, and really the prioritization of this, not just in law enforcement, but also at all levels of officialdom. Among politicians, it has to be a priority. Among the media, it has to be a priority. Just all aspects of our culture, we need to actually take this seriously. So we can look to Biden to sort of lead the way, but it's going to take all of us.
Another question just popped into my head. So Trump was banned from Twitter recently, and it's been found that since he's been banned, misinformation has sort of, I think it's sort of dropped by about half or something like that online. I was just wondering what your thoughts are about the Trump Twitter ban, because obviously a lot of people are now saying it's a freedom of speech issue, and now it's corporate censorship and all these other things, which I'd just love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it's not censorship, it's editorship.
Yeah.
Let's be clear. social media platforms are publishing platforms.
Yes.
These guys are publishers.
Yes.
And they have made the editorial decision that they're not going to permit this kind of activity on their platform, which is the right of every editor on the planet. And that's so it's not censorship; it's editing.
Yeah,
and it's astute editing because there are obviously really toxic consequences for it. Interestingly, some of the people who are most prone to calling it censorship, cough, Glenn Greenwald, cough, are have themselves on other occasions objected loudly to actually even being edited themselves.
Yes. Oh, especially Glenn Greenwald. Yes.
That's why he left The Intercept, because they tried to edit him.
God forbid there's an editor as an online publication. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So, and then they call editing censorship. So being an old editor and having worked in this business for a long time, I just have to roll my eyes.
Yeah.
But, the problem is so deplatforming like this is a very blunt instrument, and it can be effective. It's certainly, I mean, the biggest thing about it is that, as we saw with post Trump's ban, it shuts off the spigot of disinformation and stops its flow and spread so easily that and the recruitment that goes with it drops dramatically. So I think that it can be useful, but it's not effective in actually defeating the problem, because what these folks do, the real reason, or one of the reasons that the reduction in misinformation was that simultaneous with Trump's ban was also the eradication of all these QAnon and Stop the Steal and all these other misinformation accounts across all these platforms. It wasn't just Trump. There was a bunch of other people who lost their accounts and promptly moved to Parler or to Telegram or to Gab. And they're reconstituting themselves there. And now organizing new plans in these sort of darker corners. And it actually does make it harder for the people who are monitoring them to do so when they go off into these dark corners. It was very easy to monitor their plans, but they were all on Facebook, So they're like a blob of mercury. You put your blunt instrument thumb down on it, and it just squeezes out to other places, and then sort of after a while reconstitutes itself. And so I don't think it's a useful tool, but I don't think it's really, I think it's just the beginning. In order to actually deal with the larger problem, we have to take it seriously on a broad basis, and it has to be, and again, there has to be enforcement of the law. When they're like I say, the place that they're sharing these bomb making plans is on Telegram, and when that happens, that's when law enforcement should be acting. But so I think that there's really a tendency to just go, oh, well, that'll solve the problem, get rid of Donald Trump, and poof, all the misinformation goes away. But it doesn't. It just goes to darker corners and continues, at a much quieter drumbeat, but it continues to spread, and more importantly, to organize. And one of the other things that happens in these darker corners is that they become much more radical, since they don't have the sort of constraints that are imposed by, being in a larger mainstream platform. They're free to just talk. Not only free to talk as crazy as they want and extreme as they want, there's actually develops a sort of competition among themselves to see who can out crazy the other. And so they become really, really spun up into extreme radicalism in the process.
Yeah. No, I've seen that of a lot of debates on choice, that people do seem to be a bit of a competition of each other to sort of outshock each other or whatever. But it's, Oh, my goodness. Well, David, thank you so much for all that. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, just I think I'm going to Wednesday night make myself a nice martini and maybe get go buy a cigar or something.
Sounds good.
Just kick my feet up and go, because I can tell you the night that Donald Trump won was
the opposite of that.
I actually just saw all this coming down the road at us, and everything that I feared would happen has come true. Almost everything, but hasn't gotten as bad as I really feared that it might. But give them some more time. I mean, these guys are going to keep working on it, and we're going to have at least 4 more years of it.
Yeah. I mean, God, I dread to think if Trump had won the election, I dread to think where we would be in 4 years' time. So,
I would be in New Zealand.
Well, God, honestly, once COVID's over, I think we'd all want to be in New Zealand. But I mean, they're the only country seem to have handled pretty much everything so well.
I would like to be in New Zealand just because I think it's an incredibly beautiful place, and I'd love to be there. But but yeah, it's of all the countries I've visited over the last 10 years, I would say that what struck me is that its social contract really pretty intact, certainly unlike the United States.
No, it's sad. I mean, there's a lot of things we could learn from New Zealand. Sorry, just my mischievous sense of humor. I don't know if you remember the book Generation X. They have a chapter called "And New Zealand Gets Nuked Too."
Yeah, I know.
Oh dear, New Zealand's been a pipe dream for people for many years.
I think they were all in New Zealand when they were dying and on the beach. So.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. There we go. David, thank you so much for everything. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work? 2
good places. Of course, I have I'm pretty active on Twitter, so just go find me on Twitter, Neiwert, and also at Daily Kos, which is where I write 5 days a week. And one of their staff writers, and they've been great. They're a terrific platform for me.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to catch up with you again.
My pleasure, Chris. Hey, you take care and stay healthy and safe, and your family too.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.
Fillet of fish from a dish, share box and evening frocks, Big Mac down a cul-de-sac and even under a drying rack, medium fries in rainy skies, or maybe cheeseburgers in the bath. How daft. Wraps through cat flaps, nugs on rugs, or perhaps a McChicken sandwich to the river. Because yes, we deliver. Download Uber Eats or Just Eat and enjoy McDonald's at home. At participating McDonald's and locations only. See mcdonalds.co.uk/McDelivery to see if there's one near you. See Uber Eats or Just Eat app for full delivery fee applies.